I will never let them touch me.
We begin with Eddie, a junkie and writer with an excessive drinking problem. He struggles to concentrate on his work, and despite trying to compose anything fresh every day, he never produces a single word. Luckily, he secures a book-writing contract with a publishing company. He has been living on his girlfriend's income for quite a long. His girlfriend Lindy was fed up with his sloth. One day, while having lunch, she returned the key and broke up with him. Eddie tries to convince her. However, Lindy declines since she is weary of his flimsy justifications. In addition, Lindy told him that she had been promoted to editor before leaving. Eddie then walks back home with a crushed heart. While walking on the street, he encounters with ex-brother-in-law Vernon after 9 years.
You alright? You look like you're living on the streets.
Vernon invites him for a drink. A drink, seriously? How can an addictive person like Eddie refuse the offer? Eddie instantly accepts the offer, and they drink at a bar. Eddie then inquires about his ex-wife Melissa, with whom he had a sadly short marriage. In response, Vernon said he hadn't spoken to her since she moved upstate. On the other hand, Vernon is more intrigued by Eddie's book and inquires about its plot. Eddie stated that his deadline for finishing the book had passed, and he hadn't written a single word yet. Vernon replies that it is a creative problem and suggests he has a perfect solution, a pill. Eddie suddenly remembers that Vernon used to deal drugs and is still doing it. However, Vernon claims those days are long gone. He is currently employed by a pharmaceutical company. It has received FDA approval and will be available in the market next year. Nonetheless, Eddie is suspicious and refuses to grab it. According to Vernon, the typical person uses 20% of his brain. Therefore, anybody may use this tablet can access the entire brain. This pill is called NZT48, and it costs $800. He leaves his card on the table and departs. Eddie then walked back to his house. He opted to ingest the pill while walking since he pondered what could be worse than this. On his way upstairs to his flat, he runs across the landlord's wife, who threatens to kick him out.
Do you get it? You are gonna be out on the streets.
Eddie initially becomes confused before the enchantment of the magic pill takes effect. His mind starts working quicker than he could have anticipated. He finally interrupts her and inquires as to her condition. Do you have any issues at law school? She is astonished by how he is able to know this. Eddie claimed to have noticed a book corner in the bag. Eddie goes on to add that this book is inappropriate for her assignment and suggests a different one. He suddenly transforms into a legal expert despite having no knowledge of the law. She is no match to compete with Eddie's intellectual level. Hence the girl invites him to help her finish her assignment. He not only assists her with the work, but also becomes intimate with her. As he returns home, he notices the mess he created. The flat hasn't been kept tidy for a while. He quickly does a thorough cleaning. Eddie finally notices that he hasn't drunk or smoked for 6 hours and is still active to be productive. So he starts writing the book. The following morning, when Eddie woke up, he realized that the magic of the pill had gone completely. However, Eddie still has the script to show his publisher. He then visits his publisher and requests her to see the first 3 pages.
If you don't want to keep reading, I'll give you back the advance.
She supported him because Eddie was being too confident in himself. Eddie then leaves her with the script. After a while, when Eddie returns home, he discovers 3 voicemails from his publisher, who praises the screenplay and requests him to contact her immediately. Eddie is naturally ecstatic, and he decides to phone her. Nevertheless, just as he was about to call, he thought for a moment and went directly to Vernon's flat.
Vern, what happened? Trust me, you don't want to know.
Vernon already knows why Eddie is here, so he tells him the pill isn't FDA authorized and is called NZT48. Despite the fact it could be dangerous, however, Eddie wants more pills. Vernon realizes how desperate Eddie is. Therefore, he takes advantage of the circumstance and instructs Eddie to pick up laundry and purchase breakfast. Eddie has no option but to carry out his instructions. When he eventually returns to Vernon's flat, he discovers that the door has been unlocked and the entire apartment has been looted. He immediately went in search of Vernon and realized he was no more. After experiencing a huge shock, Eddie phones the police to report the crime. Eddie then does a hasty search for Vernon's stockpile. Before the police arrived, he eventually discovered the NZT48 stock, money, and journal inside the oven. The police then take him to the station for interrogation. Eddie's ex-wife calls him while he is being interrogated and tells him not to attend the burial and that she will see him later. However, the detective finds Eddie suspicious and asks him to write down his number and address. Eddie then takes another tablet when he gets home to experience the true color of life. He went to a salon to get a nice haircut, bought some new expensive clothing, finished the book in 4 days, learned the piano in 3 days, and mastered any language by simply listening to it.
Tablet a day, what I could do with my day was limitless.
Eddie picked up knowledge in all areas. One day, he was lecturing about the financial markets. During the lecture, Eddie gets the attention of a broker named Kevin. Kevin gave him a card and invited him to party on the island. At the party, Eddie is astonished to see the luxurious life of financial advisors and brokers. At that moment, Eddie decided to do trading in the financial market. Thanks to NZT-48, he already knew he would reach the pinnacle of the financial market. The next day, when Eddie returned home, he took the pill and began trading with a few hundred, although he made quite a good profit in a few days from the market. However, he didn't make much due to a lack of capital. The following day he meets a Russian mobster at a fast food restaurant to obtain a loan. Despite the mobster's initial reluctance to give him $100,000, Eddie managed to persuade him. Later that evening, Eddie meets him again in the park, and he hands over the money with a warning to return on time. The following day, he went to the brokerage house to see his friend Kevin so they could play the big game in the stock market. He traded like a seasoned expert, and over the course of the week, he profited more than $2 million. After a while, Eddie returns home and plays the voicemail from Kevin, alerting him that he has scheduled a meeting with Wall Street billionaire Carl Van Loon for the following day. That evening, Eddie apologizes to Lindy over dinner and informs her that he will be meeting with a Wall Street tycoon.
You're not in the finance game.
Eddie has transformed into a completely different guy, and Lindy is quite amazed and delighted with this new Eddie. Lindy expresses her admiration for him, and Eddie expresses his delight at seeing her again. After that, they travel to Lindy's house to spend the night together. They eventually reconcile and resume dating. Eddie quickly becomes the talk of the town.
He's Houdini. He's a prophet of our time.
At that moment, Eddie notices someone is stalking them. After ignoring it, Eddie and Lindy leave. Eddie appeared concerned that night, standing near the window to see whether the stalker was observing. Lindy invites Eddie to come to bed. Suddenly, Eddie discovered himself in the corridor after abruptly collapsing. He has no recollection of how he arrived there.
Are you okay?
The following day, Eddie meets the Wall Street mogul Carl Van Loon. Loon inquires as to Eddie's trading approach and formula for success. Eddie gave a confident response and astounded him with his remarkable analysis of market patterns and tactics. The meeting was a huge success. After that, Carl Van Loon gave him a ride at his location and handed over some company profiles to review. Loon also encouraged him to prepare for the meeting the following day. Eddie chooses to go for a stroll instead of heading home to clear his mind. Unfortunately, he lost track of time and began experiencing NZT-48's side effects once more. Eddie finds himself in a pub where he meets new acquaintances and wins them over with his sense of humor. He then gets intimate with a beautiful model in the hotel room. In the metro, a group attempts to steal him and assaults him. NZT-48 gave him the ability to recall Bruce Lee's film fighting technique and self-defense documentaries, which helped him effectively disperse the gang. Unfortunately, he has no recollection of the last 18 hours. Eddie then returns home and passes out until he wakes up limping and confused about what happened. Eddie preferred not to ingest the NZT-48 due to a protracted memory loss occurrence. Sadly, the appointment with Carl Van Loon is already planned, so he rushes to review the corporate documents. He doesn't grasp anything without NZT-48. Eddie phones Kevin to reschedule the meeting for the following day.
Don't you get it? This is your test.
He feels compelled by Kevin to be on time or he would miss this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Greedy Eddie shows up for the meeting because he doesn't want to miss out on this chance. Nonetheless, going there without NZT-48 was a catastrophic mistake. Carl queries Eddie about the renowned businessman Hank Atwood at the meeting. Eddie was bewildered and astounded. Carl noticed Eddie had made no preparations for this. At that moment, Eddie notices the news broadcast about the murder of a model is aired on television. It was the same chick he had slept with the previous evening in the hotel. As a result of his fear, Eddie abruptly ends the meeting. He then immediately returns home, believing that he may have killed her. He gets a call from Melissa out of the blue, asking whether Vernon has given him any harmful pills. Eddie insisted she met him outside rather than give her the appropriate response, and Melissa agreed. Eddie then pulls Vernon's ledger from the drawer and approaches the folks, inquiring about their health. He discovered that most of them are hospitalized owing to terrible headaches and nausea, others are in a coma, and some have died. Eddie then initiates another call to find out more, but accidentally dials the man's phone who is seated on the bench across from him. Eddie recognizes the man who has been following him for the past few days. Eddie becomes alarmed. He starts to flee from the stranger, but the man follows him as he runs. Eddie succeeds in escaping by boarding the cab. He finally met Melissa at a fast food restaurant after a protracted struggle. She admits to using the medications 2 years prior. She had unimaginable work efficiency, and she was swiftly promoted.
When I got sick, headaches.
When she observed that pushing the brain under hazardous conditions for an extended period of time would result in a mental breakdown, she suddenly stopped using it. However, she continues to have memory problems and focus issues. Finally, she observes Eddie using it and cautions him that abruptly discontinuing it may be fatal.
Do you know who makes it?
I don't know.
On his way home, Eddie bumps into Gennady. He demands a speedy money refund. Gennady roughs him up because the deadline to return the money has passed. Eddie spills NZT-48 unexpectedly, and Gennady believes it's a classy substance, so he immediately consumes it. He then accompanies him to the bank, and Gennady is thrilled about having it. Gennady leaves as Eddie pays him his money back with interest. Eddie's condition is deteriorating faster than anticipated, but he still makes it to Lindy's office. Unfortunately, he collapses there. As soon as Lindy sees him, she begins to call the ambulance out of fear. Eddie halts her and tells her the truth since he has no other option.
All this focus has been a drug.
Eddie also informs her that he conceals his pills in her residence. Lindy understands the gravity of Eddie's situation, therefore, she heads home to bring back the pills. Lindy observes someone tailing her in another cab as she is returning to the workplace via taxi. Lindy calls Eddie immediately, and he advises her to get rid of the taxi. She exits the cab and runs toward the park while the guy pursues her. Lindy asked 2 guys for help at the park, and they tried to stop him, but he stabbed both of them and proceeded to follow her. On the other hand, Lindy goes into hiding and phones Eddie to notify him of what has already occurred. Eddie advises her to take 1 pill in order to save her life. Lindy followed the advice and took the pill. She got a fantastic idea, and under NZT-48 influence, Lindy manages to flee by hitting a man in the face with an ice skater. She gave him the tablet once she got back to the workplace. After that, they travel to the hotel to spend the night together. The following morning, Eddie wakes up and apologizes to her about whatever happened in the past day. Lindy expresses her concerns about the pill, claiming it transformed her into an entirely new person.
I did things I would never do.
Eddie claims to stop taking the NZT-48 once he has accumulated sufficient wealth. Eddie tried very hard to persuade her. She nonetheless left him once again. Eddie then peers through the window and sees Gennady pursuing him in order to obtain more tablets. That evening Eddie gave him some NZT-48 in order to get rid of him for a few days. Eddie, meanwhile, hires 2 bodyguards to keep him safe from Gennady. Eddie then encounters Carl Van Loon. Carl accepts Eddie's apologies when he claims to be unwell. Carl appreciates Eddie's prognosis once more.
I fired a few people over your projections.
Along with Hank Atwood, he arranges the biggest merger in corporate history. Eddie discovers that he can avoid blackouts if he maintains the dosage of NZT-48, eats appropriately, drinks no alcohol, and sleeps well. Eddie then locates a chemist and promises him $2 million if he can reproduce it in 6 months. The offer was tempting enough that the chemist couldn't refuse it. The following day Eddie meets with the client at a fine dining restaurant. He suddenly observes that the police officer is staring at him. Eddie approached him and inquired as to what was wrong. The officer informs that he is a suspect in Maria Winberg's murder, and the witness identifies him. Eddie hires a lethal lawyer, Morris Brandt, who gets him off on the basis of circumstantial evidence. Meanwhile, the merger goes on and nears its conclusion. Carl assures Eddie that he will earn $40 million after the contract is signed.
Now I'll open up a line of credit for you.
Eddie discovers that hotels are similarly risky when he goes to his room there. As a result, he spent $8.5 million to buy a penthouse residence with all the needed security measures. Carl Van Loon and Eddie waited for Hank Atwood to sign the merger deal at Loon's office for a few hours the following day. After some time, his wife appears in place of Hank and informs him that Hank is ill and in the hospital.
Just want you to know we have every intention of signing the contract.
Eddie and Carl then accompany her to the vehicle. At that moment, Eddie understands the mystery of a stalking man. Eddie then proceeds to the police station. He hands over his jacket to the lawyer and enters an identification line. Morris Brandt, his outstanding lawyer, eventually gets him released. Eddie then went back to Carl's office, where he discovered that Hank had fallen into a coma. Eddie walks to the bathroom to take his NZT-48 because it is already beyond due time. Sadly, he found someone had stolen the pill bag from his jacket pocket. His secretary brings him a box as he exits the restroom. Eddie was surprised to open it since it contained his bodyguard's dismembered hands. Eddie then went home and saw the Hank Atwood news. At that point, he discovers that Morris is Hank Atwood's attorney. He smiled at how the lawyer tricked him into stealing NZT-48. Meanwhile, Eddie notices the uproar. He observes via the surveillance cameras as Gennady and his crew attempt to enter his apartment with metal grinders. Eddie also ran out of pills. He makes the decision to leap over the balcony rather than submit to their probably brutal treatment. Eddie quickly recalls that one tablet is still in his old tin container and goes through the boxes to get it. However, Gennady enters the apartment, causing terrified Eddies to fall on a carton and losing the last pill. Gennady then injects his own NZT-48 directly into his bloodstream, explaining how it helps to lengthen the period and enhances the benefits. Gennady then pulls out his medical equipment and begins torturing Eddie. At the same time, the other two thugs were busy using drills to break into Eddie's safe. Eddie, fortunately, discovers the knife. Eddie stabs Gennady to death as he approaches. After that, Eddie somehow manages to get rid of the other two mobsters before leaving the apartment. Eddie questioned the driver at the hospital as to why his employer had passed away since they had already possessed Eddie's NZT. That simply means the lawyer didn't hand it over to Hank Atwood. Later, the driver helps him find more tablets at the lawyer's house. A year later, Eddie's book was published, and he is now running for the US Senate. Carl pays Eddie an unexpected visit at his campaign headquarters. Carl first gives the idea that he is aware of Eddie's method and that his NZT-48 lab has been shut down.
Limitless supply. We know you can't get any more.
Carl then invites him for lunch, and he refuses him. Eddie further says that he has stopped using NZT-48. He had the medication modified in the past to remove its harmful effects, and he gradually consumed less of it until he was no longer dependent on it.
You have no idea what kind of enemy I got.
Eddie immediately demonstrates his skill by anticipating a vehicle colliding with a car since the driver is preoccupied. Carl turns around to witness what has occurred. Eddie goes on to declare that he would be 50 steps ahead of him and everybody else. Eddie then makes his way to a restaurant, where he meets Lindy. So that was Limitless. If you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, share, and turn on the notification so you won't miss the next recap. Until then, cheers.